reason Butch Cassidy came to Wyoming Territorial Prison is because he was spending a lot of time up in Lander near the Wind River Reservation. That's where he went after hiding out in Browns Park from the Telluride bank robbery, and he actually became very popular in the Wind River area. He operated a ranch with his friend Al Hayner, and that ranch kind of became a roadhouse for a lot of the cattle rustlers and horse thieves in the area. He was fencing a lot of stolen livestock. He was stealing livestock himself. And he just became a very well-respected member of that community in the small rancher sect of people in the Lander Wind River area.
Traditionally, people will associate Cassidy with hole-in-the-wall Wyoming, but I wanted to start just north of Browns Park because if you go directly north from there, you'll wind up at the Wind River Reservation. And this provides a perfect backdrop of mountains, lawlessness, a territory where U.S. authorities were sometimes afraid to go because of the status as a Native American reservation, and there was a lot of animosity between the small-time homesteaders and the larger cattle barons. In short, it was a perfect place for an outlaw to set up and avoid prosecution. But you were mentioning Butch Cassidy in the local area.
Yeah.
What kind of stories have been told about him here?
Just that he would come here to lay low every once in a while. My son is convinced that he bought property in Du Bois, and that would be easy to trace if in fact there are land deeds that have his name on them.
And he signed it with his own name, is what your son was saying.
Yeah, that he signed it with his own name. And Bill's dad was convinced that it was Butch Cassidy that stayed with them. But once again, they didn't know him before, and so if someone came by and said, "My name is Butch Cassidy, may I stay here?" they would think, well, maybe he is.
Right now I'm interviewing Maureen Miller, and she is the woman who introduced me to several people in the local area who have ties, or whose family ties lead back to Butch Cassidy. And would you say that there wasn't, because your husband was saying there wasn't sympathy, but there was an understanding?
They didn't, his parents were kind, generous, wonderful people, the grandparents. And I don't think they would have turned anyone away. And this is isolated. They were on this, the stagecoach road ran through their property on the other side of the river. And so the stagecoach would come through there, and there's a big tree over there that they used to stop and get lunch and get a drink out of the river and that sort of thing. We used to go down there and sift through the dirt, and we'd find buttons every once in a while, and just things that you could tell that people had stopped there a lot. And then they moved the stagecoach road to the highway, which is further up in the sagebrush. It's not down on the river anymore. And then the original, the highway that you came up on now is probably the third location that it's been over the last 100 years. And but they would have travelers that would stop, and they would feed them a meal or make them a sandwich or whatever, and send them on the way, or let them stay if they needed a place to stay the night. They would offer them shelter. If you follow the road a couple miles west of the town of Grossart, you turn right over the bridge and keep following that road down until you meet Miss Miller. And Miss Miller introduced me to Joe Alexander, who has lived in the community for a while longer and is an expert on the history of the place. So here I am, kind of interviewing him a little bit about his family story and how they came to be on the Wind River Indian Reservation.
My granddad started this old store in the 20s, which was up here, and he was a herded sheep before he started that, but then he opened the store, and then they started the Burris Post Office, and that was in the 20s, because I was born in 36, and we moved down here in 39, but my granddad on my mother's side, he was a freighter from Lander to Du Bois. Had a 10-team freight wagon, pulled 2 wagons, Otis Hinton, and he had 10 head of horses, and he freighted from Lander to Du Bois. It was quite an event. I guess it took over a week.
And supposedly he had a romance or two with some young ladies up there. Mary Boyd was half Shoshone, and she spoke very highly of Butch throughout the rest of his life and even after his death. And then also Dora Lamero, who came from one of the biggest ranching families in the Wind River area. She was half Lakota, and she remembers going to a dance or two with Butch, and they maintained that level of affection for him even after he came here to the prison, even after he got out and organized the Wild Bunch.
So up here at the Lander Museum in Wyoming near the Wind River Reservation, I'm actually learning a lot more about Dora Lamero, and her uncle was Chief Gall. He actually fought in the Battle of Little Bighorn, and I visited his grave in the past up in North Dakota. I'll throw in a little video of this, but the idea here is that she moved in, and her parents were actually in the community. Her mother was a Lakota, and her father was a French Canadian. And so during the time where the buffalo started thinning out and it was very difficult for them to get any food, the Lakota moved a lot closer up to the Shoshonean territory here in Wyoming. And the museum's showing me some photos I actually haven't seen online. This is the Lamoureux family, and Dora is actually the youngest child on the far left.
As far as we know, Mary Boyd, his relationship with her, that was the closest he came to getting married. That was the woman who almost got him to settle down and potentially leave the outlaw trail, but the outlaw trail was just too exciting.
Mary Boyd's claim to fame in this story is that she supposedly was with him in the 1930s when he came back to Wyoming. Now, this story kind of resonates because I was told by locals here that he was friends of their family as well in the 1930s, and he made no real effort to hide the fact that he was here. Basically, people respected him. And this part of the country, even well into the 1930s, it was small-time homesteaders, it was small business owners, and it was people who understood that if you weren't actively murdering people, you should be just kind of left alone. And that attitude still prevails, apparently. Miss Miller, she was saying that Butch Cassidy, apparently around that same time, was living in Du Bois. Mm-hmm. Years after he was supposed to have died. You have any family stories about about him?
My granddad knew him.
He did?
Oh, yeah.
So, did he have any stories about him? Was he kind of just kept to himself?
Well, granddad didn't ever say very much. He kind of kept everything to himself. But the only thing I can remember is that they said Butch Cassidy killed a guy over in Cody. And granddad didn't believe it then because Butch Cassidy never shot anybody. But granddad said then that he was back here someplace. It was camped, and Butch Cassidy had come to his camp, and he invited him to eat supper and so on and so forth. But he said told us several of us that he'd heard that this Butch had killed this guy, and so he said if he had and he'd have known it, he'd have killed Butch Cassidy right there.
When you think about Butch Cassidy, you usually think about the Bighorn Basin and the hole-in-the-wall area of Wyoming. But that got me to thinking, if he was here, were there other outlaws? Was this kind of an area that they would go to hide out from the law?
I think that there were a number of outlaw families there. Just as you leave this place, there's a bridge that you cross. That place that's just to the west of that bridge is called the Meeks place. And his dad always told me that the Meekses were part of Butch Cassidy's gang. I don't know. Or part of the Avenging Angels, depending on what mood he was in.
So this is a story that I really want to learn more about. So the Avenging Angels would have been Was Butch Cassidy LDS?
I think so. I think so. His family was, and the reason they were in Utah is because they immigrated with the LDS people.
This is actually a very interesting story. So, Maureen's father would tell her a lot of tall tales. He was something of a storyteller, but he kind of touched on the issue of destroying angels, avenging angels, and this is an early belief that Brigham Young basically had an army of vigilantes, mountain men who would go out and do his bidding. And when Brigham Young kind of left the stage of Mormonism, these vigilantes kind of just roamed the wasteland and descended into regular outlawdom. And a common one for this is the book by Wild Bill Hickman, Brigham's Avenging Angel. But there were plenty of others who made the same accusation.
Well, Miss Miller had an interesting theory. She said her father said he was one of apparently Brigham Young's avenging angels, or destroying angels, and that there were a few of those guys up here in this part of Wyoming. Have you ever heard of Wild Bill Hickman? He claims to be like a Danite.
Yeah.
But so your father's story is of the avenging angels. I think they're also called Danites.
He didn't ever tell me any stories about that. I think he thought I'd be offended. And so he didn't ever talk about those around me. But I know that they were ouchy about that. That's one of the reasons that they didn't like LDS people.
There's so many.
Well, there were so many wild people back then.
Well, true, but the one that gets the most talked about it, and whatever you want to say about it, is Butch Cassidy. And Sundance Kid was another one, but he was kind of a runner with Butch Cassidy at times. But Butch Cassidy was all the time that he said that his big three was to rob the rich and give to the poor, and that's what he done. He's been in South America. Supposed to have been worked on a freight boat on the Great Lakes, and then he's been up, and he damn sure was here. There was no doubt about it that he was up here, and up and down through here.
When was the last time he was here?
I do not know. You'd have to read it in one of those books.
Got to go find him.
Yeah,
I'm sure he's
because he
still out
had a
there.
girlfriend in Lander.
Was that Elsie Lay? Elsie, she vanished from Bolivia too.
No, this girl, the woman lived here because he would ride from Du Bois through here to Lander or something like that. Then when he would leave Lander to head to the hole in the wall, then he would stay at her place, and she always had horses and stuff for him. And but then he would go down and through Riverton and out through Point of Rocks or something over there, and that way into the hole in the wall place. I've been over to the hole in the wall, but I can never get in there because I can never. You got to know somebody.
My car almost got rutted out trying to get into hole in the wall.
Well, I've been to the end of the road, but you got to know somebody that actually lives in the hole in the wall. You're not going to get in there because there's two different ways. You can go out, from Manita out through that way, and two other else you can go over to a little town outside of Buffalo and go in that way.
I tried going up from the south, heading up, and only 5 miles until you connect on the highway and make it up to Buffalo, but the road was too muddy, and I had to turn back, and that was an extra 150 miles, and my gas tank was on empty.
But I've tried both ways of going into it, but I didn't know anybody in there. But I was working with a gal in Du Bois, Cheryl O'Brien, and we'd done a lot of history for 5 years of everything around here. She finally got contact with the people that own Hole in the Wall, live there, and she went over and spent a night there.
Do they still have cabins that he used to use out there?
No, they had a camper, just a pickup camper, but they got enough, and she went in there and looked it all over.
But there are people who also think that Butch Cassidy came back into this area to look for treasures that he buried, and that's always, that always sets everybody's hearts on fire.
Treasure stories or...
Oh yeah, they love treasure stories, yeah.
The markings?
Yeah, the cuts,
What do the markings stand for?
nothing. Just probably being bored.
And where was this found?
Oh, this was Butch Cassidy's girlfriend, Myrna Boyd, had 2 of these. And she died, and then her husband died. His name was Joe Lafferty, and he gave them to my mom. And when he died, they lived up at North Fork, and they found one. They couldn't find the other one, and it was stacked with Old West magazines. They uncovered it, and they found it, got it. And the story is there were 4 of them, just like this, and they would, this is a log split in half with holes drilled in them. They have 4 of these in a table because he never sat on the ground. He'd always sit on these haunches or on one of these benches.
I'm talking now to Kenny Slattery, an Arapaho man who lives up on the Wind River Reservation. He lives not too far away from Lander, Wyoming, which is where a lot of this takes place. And there are other people I've interviewed in the past that live in the general area, and these stories have been kind of independently corroborated that Cassidy showed back up sometime in the 1930s. And I've heard Sinks Fork Canyon mentioned specifically more than once by different people in stories that haven't been written down. These are all stories common to the families.
Well, I was just curious about some of the stories you had about Butch Cassidy and especially J.B. Chamberlain.
Oh, okay. Well, J.B. Chamberlain was my grandfather's father, my great-grandfather. He was, I don't know if he had many gangs, but he was in the gang here in Fremont County and the Wind River Reservation. He, my mom said he'd hold the horses for him, but I think he did a lot more than just hold the horses. There's a story, he was working on a ranch in Lyside, Butch Cassidy was, and he got a hold of my great-grandfather, said he needed 4 or 5 thoroughbred horses. He's only rode thoroughbreds because standard or the horse, like a quarter horse or a smaller horse, would take 2 steps while the thoroughbred would take 2. So he'd always be 2 steps ahead. Unless he ran, he could run a mile and still be outdistance the people. And that's why he'd only ride a thoroughbred. And they look better. Anyway, he worked on a ranch over Lyside, and he got a message to my grandpa that he needed these thoroughbred horses. Well, the Shoshones raised a lot of thoroughbreds, and my grandpa and Butch Cassidy did winter with the Shoshones, and well, he got a hold of him, and they did this all with flags, communication. He didn't go to the ranch and say, "Hey, I'm here." He did it with a flag. Different color flag meant something. Red flag, blue flag, I don't know. But he'd flip a flag, and Butch Cassidy knew he was there. And so he was set these horses 20 miles apart to Casper, and then come back and wait. Butch Cassidy, after work, he got on his horse, went to the trail that he was told to go to, and come back. Chamberlain went and gathered the horses up and took them around the Owl Creeks and all the way to Crowheart and got them back to their original owners. And the next morning, the Pinkerton men there were at that ranch house because it was Butch Cassidy's M.O. Somehow they figured it was him, and they wanted to see his horse. Well, his horse was dry and not sweaty, and 80-mile ride would have been pretty much sweaty and worked over. Well, they couldn't figure it out it was him. They couldn't prove it was him. They left in a car. They left in a car, scratching their heads. He got away with that.
Now, I wanted to clarify some things with the timeline here, because Kenny's story fits if you assume that Butch Cassidy survived the shootout in 1908 down in Bolivia. Essentially, he says that the Pinkertons came in a car. Well, the first widely available car, the Model T, was only manufactured in late 1908 after the shootout in Bolivia. And on top of this, he later goes on to talk about his grandma's story, I'll go into it in a minute, that he rode up to camp and basically his grandpa said, "How's it going, Butch?" Well, modern day historians who like to push the narrative that he did die in Bolivia, they like to point out that a man named William T. Phillips came up to Wyoming and probably fooled a couple of his friends into thinking that he survived the shootout in 1908, joined Pancho Villa's army, and then came back to Wyoming. I think that this is a little bit crazy. We now know that William T. Phillips was a bit of a nutcase and wasn't the real Butch Cassidy, but he was a very interesting person. He did volunteer with Pancho Villa, and he had the scars to prove it. And William T. Phillips probably did muddy up a little bit of the Butch Cassidy history, but I really don't think that Boyd, his ex-girlfriend, or a lot of his other very close associates, would totally mistake the two. They looked pretty distinct.
But you were saying that, especially after the winter of 1888 killed all the cattle, that Butch Cassidy would basically gift maverick cows to farmers.
Oh yeah. Not all of them. Most of them, were ruthless people here. But yeah, he would. They'd wake up in the morning and their corral would be full of these cows with no brand on them, or a horse, saddle horse. Maybe came from Utah or Idaho. And nobody knew, but they used it, and probably till it died or sold it. And then a lot of times, gold coins on their front step. They're still finding coins over in Johnson Canyon. That's in the Wind River Canyon, offshoot of the Wind River Canyon. They say there's Butch Cassidy has a stash in Johnson Canyon.
I'd heard from someone else that he buried some treasure. Do you think there's any truth to it? They say he came up here in the 30s and was looking for something.
Well, Joe Lafferty used to say he had a cache on St. Lawrence Basin. There's a bunch of trees and there's gravel like up on top, and there's no trees there. Well, this happened to be when he was there. There was 2 trees in the middle of this gravel above timberline, and he said there was a cache in between those 2 trees, and I don't think anybody's ever went to look for it. The trees are gone now, but somebody with a 4-wheeler could go with a metal detector and
Would you know where those are?
it's about a 10-mile stretch.
Could acquire a 4-wheeler for us?
A lot of times when he'd travel through here, I don't know where he'd go, maybe Cokeville or somewhere. People had a lot of friends. He was a good guy. But when he'd come to Lander, I don't know how the population was at that time, but it couldn't have been very big. The word would spread quickly that Butch was in town. Party, big party, come on. Well, there'd be a guy on a horse. He'd head that way, wherever there was, Sings Canyon or Sage Creek, somewhere up in the Wind River Mountains. He'd have a get together, and not just for an hour or two. It'd be for a week long. Next, a wagon would go with beer, and another wagon about an hour later with girls, and the band would go, and they'd come home the same way, 1, 2 at a time, and then next thing you know, the whole party would be down back in Lander, and nobody knew the difference. They'd all, Butch would be gone, probably to Montana or Canada. They said there's an international highway for a saddle horse on the Wind River Mountains. It can go all the way to Canada and all the way to Mexico. And he'd get on that road a lot, just as him and his horse.
And what years was this about?
Well, my mom saw him in 1933, so probably be that and before then.
Well, I've got another guy saying that Butch Cassidy did come back in 33 to Sings Canyon. And what's crazy is people say he died in 1908.
Yeah, I don't think so. My grandpa knew him well, and my mom and her 2 sisters and my grandpa were up at St. Lawrence Basin. No gun, and just an axe. And there were a lot of bears up there, and my Aunt Faye was the cook, and so she'd cooking things, and it's probably smelled pretty good. Here come this cowboy on a big gray horse, and my grandpa looked up and he goes, "Hello, Butch." And Butch looked down, he goes, "Hello, Jess." And sit down. He never sat on the ground. Grandma said he'd always sit on his haunches, or he'd have a chair, or a rock, or something. He'd never sit on the ground. And he never shot anybody. And he always rode a thoroughbred horse. Well, they talked and laughed. Butch Cassidy pulled out these matches, lit one on fire, and they'd been in the cache for 20 years, he said. The cache was dry. And Jess said, that's good. And you know, the birds at that time, they were quiet before he came, and then they all started clattering, glowing. They call them camp robbers. And but my grandpa asked Butch, he said, Butch, are you still as good a shot as you ever was? Oh, he says, I don't know. I don't know if I am or not. About that time he shot, the bird landed right by the fire. And they laughed about that. And my mom and her two sisters, they were in the little teepee they had, watching and scared to death, like he was going to shoot their dad. But he was his friend. And he rode off. He asked him to spend the night. He said, no, I'm headed to Canada and Montana. And this was in 1933. And that was from my mom's own mouth. She told that story many times.